This is a celebration of a side of military flying that's often unsung. It's usually taken for granted and it doesn't often hit the headlines. This is a story of airlift, the aircraft that fly it and the men and women that fly the aircraft. People who are sometimes disparagingly referred to by flyers of more dashing machinery as truckies. And far and away the commonest truck for a truckie to fly is the C-130 Hercules. Royal Air Force Lyneham in Wiltshire is home base for the RAF 61 Hercules. Each year, 150,000 passengers and 18,000 tons of freight pass through this base. The aircraft fly 14,000 sorties and use up 12 million gallons of fuel in the year. Lyneham's 3,500 personnel offer a 24-hour-a-day, 365 days a year service. The aircraft are involved in almost everything the RAF does, in peace and war, for humanitarian or military purposes. They also provide much of the Army and Navy's air transport. This ancient Land Rover in its desert colour scheme, it's an exhibit at Lyneham's own Museum of Air Transport, it belonged to the Special Air Service, who have particularly close links with the Lyneham Hercules. Of course, like everything the SAS owns, you could drop it from an aircraft. Other air-droppable items in the museum date from the Falklands conflict. Before the war in the Gulf, that had been Lynham's biggest operational task. It involved a fully loaded Hercules leaving Lyneham every 4 hours for 3 months. And here's one of the areas in which the Army plays a big part, in the shape of 47 Air Dispatch Squadron of the Royal Corps of Transport.
This container here is the waterproof 1-ton container. It was designed and used exclusively in the Falkland Islands for resupplying the ships of the task force on the way down. It's cardboard coated with silicone to help it be waterproof. It's fitted with a lot of flotation, so it floated on the water. It's fitted up here with a parachute disconnect, and that's to allow the parachute to separate from the load and stop the load from getting moved around in the water. To help recovery of this, it's fitted with a Sabi beacon here, which allowed the helicopters to home in on the load and pick it up.
A lot of what the operational crews do is training of one sort or another, and it takes them all over the world. But here, the flight crew of Hercules 298 are planning something a bit different. They're off to Pope US Air Force Base in North Carolina to compete in the biggest airlift contest in the world. It's the Airlift Rodeo. To the Lyneham Operations Room staff, it's just one more flight amongst the 40 they're dealing with that day, here going to Iceland and Washington, D.C., among other places.
Good morning, Squadron Leader Burgoyne, checking in for flight 4629. Is it? Steady back here, please, sir. There's the bag there.
The departure lounge may not be quite as plush as your average civil airport, but the system's pretty similar. As the crews get on board, some of them to fly the aircraft, some as passengers, there's a last chance for family goodbyes. Long periods apart are something service families get used to.
Ascot 4828, taxi runway 07, the QFE 998, fire entry 3.
G3 998 and 07, 4828, taxis.
As Flight Lieutenant Max Burton taxis his aircraft out, he and the rest of the competition crew know that all their skills and training are going to be tested to their limits. A week of needle competition is going to pit them against the best airlift teams in the Western world.
Ascot 4828, Lyneham, be clear on track, flight level 60, stud 51 airborne, squawk 2661.
When they get back, they may have a trophy or two under their belts, but win or lose, they'll certainly return with new additions to their expertise in the business of airlifting. A couple of months earlier, some of the competition crew had found themselves at the USAF base at Mildenhall in Suffolk for some training. Some bits of the training were harder than others. These men are soldiers, not airmen, but they are part of the only Army unit to be permanently detached to an RAF station. 47 Air Dispatch Squadron of the Royal Corps of Transport has the job of making up the loads on platforms so that they can be air-dropped. They also fly in the back of the Hercules, which is when they really earn their titles as air dispatchers. As the aircraft runs in over the drop zone, it's important for the air dispatchers to coordinate closely with the flight deck crew if the load is to be dropped on time and on target. As the platform's early headlong descent slows to a gentler pace, everyone's hoping it'll hit the ground near the target marker. During the competition, they'll lose points for every foot it lands away from the target.
It's going to be land at about 10 at Wizzery, no earlier, no later, just to do a day of tack landings.
So you don't want AUs at all on Monday?
No load, no low level, no nothing on Monday.
Still Wednesday and it's the day there.
For the day, Air Force and Army get together over a bevy to dissect the day's results and plan the next day's training.
See whether I could get a trip with them. So if they're going to be dropping to...
Military airlift came into its own during World War II, but it received its peacetime baptism in 1948, when the Soviets cut the land routes to West Berlin and tried to starve the Western powers out of the city. For 11 months, the city was supplied with all the essentials of life by air. At the height of the airlift, an aircraft was launched every 4 minutes, day and night. RAF Transport Command pitched in with the United States Air Force for the task. The brunt of the RAF operation was carried on by the ubiquitous DC-3 Dakota and also by the new 4-engined Hastings transport. In all, 400,000 tons of food, fuel and other supplies were delivered. These military transports were the same shape as civil aircraft, and you had to load them from the side. It was tricky getting a vehicle into a DC-3. Indeed, despite its success in the Berlin Airlift, the DC-3 was also short on range and speed and the amount of load it could carry. One answer was the flying boxcar, the Fairchild C-119. With its twin booms leaving space for the rear opening clamshell doors and its self-contained ramp, it was one of the first transports to be developed solely for military work. The 119 military transport, often referred to as the $19, was sold to 7 countries outside the US, and in US service the $19 was extensively used in the Korean War. But with one engine out, it was dangerously underpowered. Its unreliability instilled a great fear of flying into young paratroopers. Plus, like the Dakota, the boxcar was also short on range and payload. Next were larger 4-engined aircraft like this early Douglas C-74 Globemaster and the Boeing C-97 Strato Freighter, which came in a tanker version as well. These aircraft had much better range and payload, but they weren't what the military calls tactical. What was needed was a rugged aircraft that could fly from unprepared surfaces and carry 30,000 pounds of payload over 1,500 miles. This was one such, and it was definitely tactical. This was the prototype turboprop-engined Lockheed C-130, which first flew in 1954. Apart from its so-called Roman nose, it looks pretty much like the Hercules C-130 that it developed into, and which has proved such an outstanding success over the subsequent 3.5 decades. The Hercules won its spurs in Vietnam, but a couple of years before it had appeared on the scene, a new piston-engine tactical transport had been delivered to work with the CH-46 helicopters. The C-123 Provider had been designed by Chase Aircraft and developed by Fairchild as a successor to their C-119 boxcar. By the end of 1967, the Provider and the Hercules between them had broken all previous airlift records. Perhaps the best known of all the Vietnam airlift operations was the breaking of the siege of the American base at Khe Sahn. In the first month of the siege, they moved 11,000 tons of supplies into the base and brought out 3,000 troops and refugees and wounded. The airfield was surrounded by Viet Cong, and takeoffs and landings, as well as unloading areas, were under constant artillery and mortar fire. After a Marine KC-130 was brought down by ground fire, all further landings were banned by the local US commander, and from then until Khe Sahn was relieved, it was resupplied by air-delivered stores. All sorts of different ways of delivering the stores were used. Here, the container delivery system operates from a height of a couple of 100 feet. The parachutes deploy as soon as the containers drop out of the back of the aircraft, and that slows the containers' descent just enough to stop them breaking up when they hit the ground. Here, a C-123 Provider drops bigger individual palletized loads from a bit higher. And sometimes the C-130 Hercules would drop 12 containers in one go from 800 feet. But perhaps the most dramatic was LAPES, the low-altitude parachute extraction system, where the parachute merely drags the load out of the aircraft, which is so low that the huge platform doesn't have far to drop. Occasionally, a really big individual load would provide a good target for the enemy gunners. See how this platform turns on its end just before it hits the ground after one of its parachute lines is severed. The siege of Khe Sahn lasted 2.5 months and ended in mid-April 1968. Airlift is essentially non-aggressive, but you can put big guns in a transport and make it a gunship, like this AC-47, A for armed. In Vietnam, they called it Puff the Magic Dragon. Its .3-inch miniguns could fire 100 explosive shells a second. Hercules gunships, AC-130s, can now carry artillery-size howitzers. The AC-130 is one of more than 30 versions of the Hercules. Another is this MC-130 Combat Talon. It can pick people up off the ground or the sea without landing, people like James Bond, you may remember. But this demonstration of the Fulton surface-to-air recovery system is not in a film, it's for real, although it's so uncomfortable that it's only done with dummies except in real emergency. Yet another version is the HC-130P Long-Range Search and Rescue Hercules. It works as a team with the HH-53 Jolly Green Giant rescue helicopters, and among other things it keeps them refueled so that the whole team can operate far out into the ocean or even into enemy territory. Military airlift operations are not exclusively for the benefit of the military. The 1960s US civilian research program in Antarctica was maintained by LC-130Fs. The LC indicates that this Hercules has skis as well as wheels. During Operation Deep Freeze, as it was known, they airlifted some £10 million of supplies annually. The 4,500-mile round trip from New Zealand took the crews regularly over waters cold enough to kill them instantly if they'd had to ditch, which fortunately they didn't. These Hercules became the biggest aircraft to operate from a skiway, which was what they called the ice and snow runway. In 1984, airlifters found themselves at the opposite end of the climatic scale in a huge international effort to save lives in Ethiopia. Years of civil war and unseasonal droughts had, not for the first or the last time, left a whole nation facing famine. Among many nationalities, the British were represented by No. 70 Squadron from Lyneham in Wiltshire. Their 80-strong detachment remained in Ethiopia for 14 months. The scorched terrain was clearly visible from the air, giving a clue to the biggest operational problems for the aircraft, the heat and the altitude. The runways were often quite big, but at altitudes around 8,000 feet and temperatures of 25 degrees Celsius, the landing performance of even the rugged Hercules is much degraded, particularly with loads of 30 to 40,000 pounds. However, loads like that, nearly 20 tons of grain from this Belgian Air Force Hercules, were at least getting to the airstrips, despite everything the climate and the topography could throw at the airlift force. But a further problem gradually became apparent with the failure of ground transport links between the remote airstrips and the more mountainous areas of population. Despite the huge airlift effort, the food was still not getting to the people who needed it. The answer was low-level air dropping techniques. No parachutes here, just 16 wooden baseboards, each with 20 bags of grain tied onto it. In theory, they're dropped from 35 feet above ground, but sometimes it's rather less. The speed of the aircraft is around 125 knots, but the amazing thing is, more than 95% of the bags, which are triple wrapped, survive intact. And the ones that do burst, well, the people on the ground are said to have recovered every last grain. And when the drop's over, an essential part of the proceedings is the low flyby to say goodbye and good luck. The airdropping of supplies is the subject of continuing research by units like the Joint Air Transport Establishment, JATE, at Boscombe Down. This high-speed JATE film shows 5 parachutes deploying to half their full size until they've dragged their load out of the aircraft. This is the so-called reefed mains extraction system, where you don't need separate parachutes to pull the load out. That's the view from the loaded platform, and finally there are the 5 chutes now unreefed and fully deployed. Further airlift research as this C-130 gets its already impressive takeoff performance improved by the use of jet-assisted takeoff, or JATO for short. It's a misnomer really, because the 8 small additional power units behind the main wheels there are actually rockets. No, this is not an unusual airlifter version of the Phantom F4. On the contrary, this is a type of flying from which transport aircraft, other than helicopters, are usually excluded. But the flexibility that carrier-borne operations offer depends on regular resupply facilities being available, and available without the carrier having to move off station. Imagine the benefits then of being able to land a medium-sized transport aircraft on a carrier, and of course take it off again afterwards. In the 60s, they did a trial on the USS Forrestal to see if it was feasible to operate the Hercules from a carrier. Bear in mind that the Phantom, and most other regular shipborne aircraft, need steam catapults to get off and arrestor gear to stop them going off the end when they land. But the Hercules wasn't designed with any of that in mind, and so it had to be able to operate without either catapult or arrestor. First of all, they tried a touch and go. The 2 Navy pilots chosen for the trial, Lieutenant Commander Stovall and Lieutenant Flatley, had never flown a 4-engined aircraft before. But they were able to make the first C-130 carrier landings after only a short period of training. They went on to complete 29 touch-and-go landings and 21 unarrested full-stop landings and unassisted takeoffs. During the trial, the aircraft's gross weight was gradually increased to 121,000 pounds, which allowed them to carry in 30,000 pounds of payload, more than 13 tons. Touchdown had to be within 50 feet of the end of the deck. When the aircraft was just 4 feet up, the ship's signal officer would call for engine cut, and the pilot would slam the throttles into reverse, so the propellers would actually be in reverse pitch by the time the wheels hit the deck. On takeoff, they'd run up full power before letting the brakes off. Once on the move, the captain would steer with the nose wheel steering and subsequently the rudder, while the co-pilot would keep the wings level with the control column. When they got to rotation speed, the captain would take over the control column and complete the takeoff. So, transport aircraft on carriers, and as we saw earlier, transport aircraft as gunships. Is there any field of military flying where truckies can't insinuate themselves? Well, this may be another unlikely role, the formation display team. The first one in the early 60s belonged to the USAF's Green Weasel Squadron at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, more properly known as the 433rd 774th Troop Carrier Squadron. The team adopted the title Hercules and the Four Horsemen, but everybody else soon began to call them the Thunder Weasels. The team happened more or less by accident when the squadron was practicing parachute drops with their then new C-130s. Some of the parachute operations required them to fly in loose formation, and when one day the parachuting was cancelled, 4 crews decided to tighten up the formations and fly them for their own sakes. And of course, once you begin to call yourselves a formation team, one of the things you have to be able to do is a break. The Thunder Weasels became an unofficial display team for Tactical Air Command. They flew at Air Force bases, not only at home, but also in Europe and the Far East. And the Air Force allowed them to do so as a demonstration of the maneuverability of the new aircraft and the professionalism of the crews. But Air Force acceptance of the Horsemen stopped short of official designation as an aerial demonstration team because aircraft and crews could not be spared permanently from normal duties. Which was a pity, really, because by then they'd got some really good breaks going. The idea of a full-time Herc team never seems to have caught on, but there have been teams put together for special occasions, as witness this magnificent bunch of no less than 15 Hercules from Royal Air Force Lyneham, seen at the 1987 International Air Tattoo. They were celebrating the theme of the tattoo that year, Skylift 87. It was subtitled Wings of Peace, in recognition of the humanitarian aspects of this versatile arm of the military. And versatility, or perhaps manoeuvrability, was the key word for this part of the tattoo display. This is a Swedish Air Force C-130 doing things that look more fighter-like than trucky-like. He's definitely at more than 90 degrees of bank there. Next, an example of how propellers are better than jets, at least for airshow purposes, because if you look closely here, you can actually see that the two outer engines are just starting, having been stopped with their propeller blades feathered for minimum drag. The C-130 has the unique distinction among military aircraft of having been in continuous production for 35 years. The first was delivered to the USAF in 1956. By February 1991, 1,950 had been delivered to customers in 60 countries, with 36 new aircraft being built every year. Although the C-130 is often referred to in the tabloid press as the giant Hercules freighter, it's quite small by current transport aircraft standards. The aircraft that these troops are getting into for a routine parachuting exercise is the next size up, and it can carry almost twice the payload of the Hercules. Nearly 300 of these aircraft are in service with the US Air Force. It's from the same Lockheed stable as the Hercules, but unlike the Herc, it's a pure jet. In fact, when it entered service in 1965, it became the first pure jet strategic military freighter. This is the C-141 Starlifter. In its early service, the Starlifter suffered from lack of volumetric space in the freight bay, so all C-141s were stretched by 23 feet to become C-141Bs. That increased their payload capability by a quarter to nearly 90,000 pounds. Starlifters have been just about everywhere the US forces operate. During the Southeast Asia War, they provided the air bridge between continental US and bases in Vietnam, Thailand and the Philippines and Guam. They flew more than 6,000 aeromedical evacuation flights. But perhaps the time they became most famous was during Operation Homecoming, when they repatriated US prisoners of war from North Vietnam in 1973. And of course they played a major role in bringing troops and equipment to and from the Middle East during the 1991 Gulf War. Here though, the 141 is demonstrating its ability to drop up to 155 paratroops.
Red light.
This is the air-launched version of the Tomahawk cruise missile that proved itself on the streets of Baghdad in the Gulf War. ALCM stands for Air-Launched Cruise Missile. The Baghdad missiles were launched from ships. This one, as the name suggests, can be launched from several aircraft types. One of them is this rather smartly painted B-52 strategic bomber. It's an interesting combination because the cruise missile is essentially a tactical weapon carrying either a nuclear or conventional explosive warhead. But launched from a long-range bomber, it becomes strategic, albeit with a comparatively small warhead. Incidentally, you can tell this is a trial flight because there's evidently no explosive in the warhead. But the real irony is that if you want to air-launch a genuinely strategic missile, you have to do it from an airlifter, because the missile's too big to go in the bomb bay or under the wing of a bomber. This airlifter is one of the biggest aircraft in the world. It can carry 345 equipped troops on 2 decks, or £250,000 of freight over nearly 3,000 miles without refuelling. Like the Starlifter, it's in service with the US Air Force Military Airlift Command. It's the Lockheed C-5 Galaxy. In 1974, 4 years after entering service, the Galaxy proved the feasibility of air-launching a Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile. At a height of 20,000 feet, the missile was dragged out of the freight bay by extractor parachutes. The missile was released from its cradle, and when it was in a near vertical position, by this time having fallen to 8,500 feet, its engines fired, and proved that it was technically feasible to make ICBMs air mobile. "15 years later, in 1989, the C-5 was in the record books again. This time it was a developed version of the aircraft called the C-5B with stronger wings and more powerful engines. A C-5B of the 436th Military Airlift Wing set a world record by airdropping a load weighing more than 190,000 pounds. That's more than 85 tons. The load was 4 Sheridan tanks and 73 paratroops from the 82nd Airborne Division. The troops have to wait until the tanks have gone, but they seem to be enjoying the wait. And as the tanks come down, you can see there one reason why it's that way round. Having one of those things land on you could ruin your day. But now it's their turn anyway, and Mac's then Commander-in-Chief, General Dwayne Cassidy, explained why they went for this record.
The record represents something we started to do a long time ago, and that was to try to move big things forward. It's not only a display showing us what our training has provided and can do, it also shows clearly, I think, to everyone that there's lots of things that we can do. Good old Yankee ingenuity is alive and well, is what it says.
In 1983, Mac went into action providing airlift for the US forces involved in the invasion of the Caribbean island of Grenada. These Army Rangers found themselves boarding C-141s at Pope Air Force Base in North Carolina, destination Point Saline, Grenada. Meanwhile, other Starlifters had ferried men and equipment to a staging post about 170 miles from Grenada on the island of Barbados. Early on the morning of 25th of October, 10 aircraft dropped paratroops on the new airfield at Point Saline. Their job was to secure the airfield for more troops to fly in. The 9,000-foot runway had been built under the supervision of Cuban military advisors, and at the time of the invasion it was nearing completion. Its construction had been cited by the United States as one of the reasons for the invasion, since it was said to be suitable for military jets. The next day, C-5s were bringing the bigger equipment into Barbados. And Barbadian troops and police were preparing to leave for Grenada. There, parts of the operation were going quite well for the US invaders, and American students at a medical school on the island were evacuated. The US government kept strict limits on media reporting of the operation, and even afterwards the security was tight. But there have been persistent reports of failures in some operational aspects. In the airborne assault of Point Saline, the C-130s flew over the airfield one at a time instead of in airdrop formation, and there were reports that the first 2 aircraft broke off their approach when they encountered unexpected hostile gunfire.
Control.
Other reports talk of the operation that was to drop the Navy's Special Force SEAL teams off the island coastline early in the morning. They used the low-altitude parachute extraction system, LAPES, that we saw earlier, to drop the SEAL teams into the water in their rubber boats. One team is said to have drowned when they were dropped from too great a height. But despite the evidence of failures, the overwhelming size of the US forces ensured eventual success, and the operation illustrated the concept of the tactical use of the C-130 Hercules to pave the way for strategic use of the C-141 Starlifter and the C-5 Galaxy. But now it's rodeo time, and the competition crew from Royal Air Force Lyneham arrive at Pope Air Force Base, North Carolina on cue. Led by skipper Flight Lieutenant Max Burton, they get the welcome from the rodeo girls and the rodeo colonel. The ground crew come next. Some snaps for the squadron album. Closely followed by the arrival briefing. Pope Air Force Base is actually within the Army's Fort Bragg. Over the next week, 1,500 crew members will engage in needle competition to find the best of the best. The Americans come from MAC active service units, the Air National Guard, Air Force Reserves and the Marine Corps, and there are 13 other foreign national teams taking part as well. This is the 11th International Air Lift Rodeo, and the idea of the competition is to test the skills of all the people whose job is military airlift, and test them in as real a combat training scenario as possible. Having got the tent cities up, it's time for some shut-eye. There was stiff competition for the most eye-catching frontage. Some teams even brought their own pools. The Brits claimed an early competition success in the race to get their zaps on the rodeo girls.
I'd like to officially welcome all of our teams and guests to the 1990 Airlift Rodeo. It's a very great opportunity for not only people of our country, but from teams, 4 teams from around the world, to further our airlift capability.
We've got the best there is right here. So aviators, maintainers, controllers. Let's now do who's the best. Go for it.
The RAF Herky Bird gets a good wash down, and it isn't just to please the judges. You can see oil leaks and other external faults more easily on a clean aircraft. There's also the chance to cool off in the 90-degree temperatures and 90+ humidity of the Carolinas. Ground engineers work round the clock to make sure their aircraft are in perfect shape. In the maintenance section of the competition, they're going to be judged on how well they complete one pre- and one post-flight inspection and one refuelling operation. They'll also get 4 random daily checks on their progress, and the inspectors can arrive at any time, eager to pounce on the smallest detail of servicing malpractice. The Lyneham team are soon in a spot of bother, with a lot of valuable points at risk. The team leader, Wing Commander Peter Bedford, gets the gen from his engineering officer, Squadron Leader Mike Eagles.
Okay, Mike, what's the problem on this pre-flight inspection?
Basically, sir, the umpires have said that the brake wear indicator is very loose and therefore could fall out, and they actually want to dock us 100 points. That's a lot of points already in the competition.
That's ridiculous.
Well, I'm saying that it is loose, but only slightly loose, and the way it's designed, it can't fall out, and therefore I'm only looking at a 4-point deduction. I wish to appeal against it.
The appeal goes in, the judges huddle, the tension mounts. They couldn't, could they?
Okay, Mike, what's the news on the pre-flight?
Well, the umpires have decided only to take off us -4 points. It's not a major, it's only a minor, and that puts us on equal first place with the Australians on the pre-flight, which is good news.
So Lyneham and the Aussies are splitting first place in maintenance. Meanwhile, the C-141 spot landing contest is underway. The test ground for the 141s is Pope's main runway. The target for the main wheels a point 1,000 feet in from the approach end runway threshold. The other more tactical aircraft, the C-130s and the Franco-German C-160 Transall, compete in a different class. They do their spot landings on a rough assault strip at Luzon. This German Air Force C-160 is first in. In this class, the scores are based on 3 landings, with points deducted for every foot they miss the landing point by. Bounces are also penalised. Time for the judges to get down to the real nitty-gritty, with the accent on the gritty. It's hot as well. Next is the Lyneham team, with Max Burton jockeying the Herc through the hot air turbulence onto what he hopes is just the right approach path for that landing spot. But he'll lose points because he touches down past it. It was a highly experienced crew led by Lieutenant Colonel Schlam from Base 27 in Israel that finally ran away with the top honours for the best C-130-160 aircrew and the best foreign team. The next mission is the first of 3 airdrop sorties. The crews get their targets at PR-24, 24 hours before their scheduled dropping time. There's a lot of thick forest around Fort Bragg, so identifying the turning points won't be easy. Navigator Flight Lieutenant Simon Brailsford will have his work cut out. And in the meantime, the barracking from the rest of the team's taking the form of graffiti. Planning goes on late into the night, too late for some. And it's no different for the other teams either. The Brits are up and at the aircraft bright and early. Each of the 3 airdrop sorties lasts about an hour. It's all conducted at low level, and the time on target is all important. The takeoff time and the times at the various navigational turning points are calculated to the second from the target time and the wind and temperature forecasts. For the other 2 sorties, they'll drop a loaded container on one and some troops on the other. But this sortie is a medium-stressed platform drop. As this British version of the Hercules taxis out, the air-to-air refuelling probe over the flight deck there is very obvious. It's one result of the Falklands conflict, but it's a facility that the RAF is still pleased to have, even if they don't need it for this particular trip. Once airborne, they head for the first of 6 compulsory turning points. Each one has to be positively identified. Umpires travel on the sortie and check everything the crew does, including how closely they overfly each turning point. Meanwhile, down the back, the load on its platform is being made ready for dropping. But it can't be released completely because the turbulence is bad this close to the ground. Everyone helps with the lookout, both for other aircraft and also for the ground features. Navigator Simon Brailsford identifies a feature on his map and moves back to update his navigation equipment. The aircraft bounces through the turbulent air, never steady for a moment, and for those not used to it, the heat and the motion can be very unsettling. The crew's meticulous preparation and split-second accuracy is paying off. The point before the drop zone, the target approach point, comes up on time, and about 10 miles out, the checks on the load are completed, the aircraft slows down, and the ramp is lowered. On the drop zone, more umpires wait to assess the drop accuracy and timing. There goes the drogue that streams the main parachutes, and as they deploy, the platform hurtles out over the ramp. There's nothing more the aircrew can do now except hope for a good descent and landing. And they get it, on time, on target. All that remains is to check that the load is still working. The next day at Tony Drop Zone, it was time for the troops to be dropped rather than their vehicles. The usual umpires and observers move in, and this time they're accompanied by the medics. The Huey helicopter has to be off the drop zone in good time, because no propeller or rotor blades are allowed to be turning on the ground when people are dropping. The wind conditions are tricky as the first competitor approaches, which means that getting the jumpers close to the target will be difficult. The T-10 parachutes the Army Rangers use are barely controllable, unlike the free fall parachutes that are becoming so popular. so the aircrews can't expect any help from the jumpers with their drop accuracy. It's not just that the parachutes are virtually uncontrollable, you hit the ground rather faster than you do with a flyable modern canopy, so it's much more unusual for jumpers to remain standing when they land. Points in this part of the competition depend on how far the first jumper in the stick lands from the target. In this case, a captain who's prepared for the worst, but pleased when it's better than that.
Great jump. Good day to be a paratrooper.
Back at Dodge City, organisers and competitors can relax some of the time. Snack up on fast food and shop for the latest in rodeo style. Regular checks on the giant competition scoreboard are a must, and even towards the end of the whole contest, the battle for the overall lead is as close as ever, and there's evidently much still to play for. Next event is the ERO, engines running onload and offload. Like all the segments of the competition, this is based solidly on real active duty situations. Crews have to get a pickup truck and 2 3/4-ton trailers off the aircraft and back on again as quickly as possible, safely. One of the reasons for wanting it done quickly is that in wartime they may be under fire while they're doing this. Whilst the Starlifter ERO contest is underway, the Lyneham team are honing their ERO skills with repeated practice sessions. Another segment involves combat control teams performing a halo drop, standing for high altitude low opening. When they land, they have to establish a drop zone under simulated gunfire. And it's those sort of ground combat skills and endurance that are tested in this grueling 18-mile obstacle course. It calls not only for fitness, but also for team cooperation. The British entry is a joint team drawn from the RAF's United Kingdom Mobile Air Movement Squadron and the Army Royal Corps of Transport's 47 Air Dispatch Squadron. But even the most fun things have to come to an end sometime, and eventually it's time for the boys to drag themselves away for the closing ceremonies.
Right, boys, lap of honour.
Sorry. Lyneham and the Australian Air Force team did eventually split the top honours in the pre-flight inspection, but Wing Commander Peter Bedford and the Lyneham ground crew took away the overall prize for best C-130-160 maintenance. And the top prize for the best transport wing went to the 63rd Military Airlift Wing from Norton Air Force Base, California. So, prizes presented, trophies taken, speeches spoken, it's time to get down to some serious celebrating. Although there are surely some disappointments here after such high-pressure needle competition, it doesn't seem to matter in the frenetic after-contest wind-down. As with competition at the top levels of any profession, it's the taking part that probably matters most to most of these people. The Lyneham team are not above using some non-regulation paintwork to make sure no one forgets who won the maintenance prize. And that'll be important when they get home, because there's no time for resting on any laurels. There's certainly no welcome home from the British weather, although perhaps it's quite nice after hot, humid Carolina. Anyway, it's not going to stop them having a snap for the Lyneham album. Two months later, there was little to celebrate when some of the airlift rodeo crews found themselves doing it for real. The Iraqi annexation by force of Kuwait sparked off the mounting of the biggest show of armed might the world has seen since the Second World War. And as ever, it was the mounting process that called for extraordinary efforts on the part of the airlifters. The men and aircraft from Lyneham were once again in the forefront of the British effort in an airlift operation that was to break all previous records. The statistics were staggering. 100 million pounds of freight moved, more than 45,000 tons, 10 million miles flown, and 24 million gallons of fuel burnt. The biggest player was, of course, the US Military Airlift Command, which mounted operations on an unprecedented scale in its effort to move the enormous quantity of payload into the Gulf theatre of operations. Each British fighter squadron needed 100 sorties from Lyneham to bring their materiel and manpower resources up to battle readiness. Even before some of the aircraft had received their desert camouflage paint schemes, they were airborne on patrol. Here, a fighter fires off self-defensive flares to decoy hostile heat-seeking missiles. Hostilities in the air were opened by an aircraft so secret that its very existence was unknown to the public for the first 8 years of its operational life. In the Gulf, the F-117A's stealth fighter achieved complete tactical surprise on the Iraqis, because they never knew it was coming until it had taken out their all-important radar and their command and control centers with surgical accuracy using precision-guided bombs. But whether it's this sort of highly sophisticated weaponry, or more conventional aircraft, or tanks and foot soldiers, they all depend vitally on supply and resupply by airlift. And that means the men, the women, and their aircraft, always ready to deliver on time, on target.
Lyneham.